This was the final title of what I ended up doing. It was Addressing Death, Fashioning Garments for the Grave. I have a couple of photos that might be disturbing. I haven't got any photos of people, but in talking about one of my major projects, there are some pretty bizarre photos. I haven't put any of the really graphic ones in. So I started my PhD when I was 23. I had just come out of the Bachelor of Design in Fashion, which I'd started when I was 18, and I'd come straight out of high school, and I really didn't have much in terms of life experience. So I didn't have a practice. I had things I really liked, but I didn't have the experience of working in the field. So for me, a lot of it was about developing my practice through my research. And so where I sit now, I had no idea that's where I'd be in 2008 when I started. I actually work a lot in the School of Fashion and Textiles. I'm a lecturer there full time, but I also work in the funeral industry, which is a bit bizarre when I make frocks. Anyway, that was my mantra that I kind of kept coming back to. I'm meant to be a fashion designer, I'm meant to be a fashion designer, and I'd find myself knee deep in a grave going, but I make frocks. But I make frocks, what's happening? So your PhD will get tied up at the end. It's nice and neat, but for a lot of the time, it isn't. So when I graduated from the undergrad course, I just had an internship in Japan, and one of the techniques I'd learned about was using this dissolvable yarn. It was with Yoshika Hishinuma, who's a textile artist, and he used a lot of dissolvables in terms of creating scaffolds that he could then remove seamlessly, and you'd have no idea that that's how that process was done, and it was very hidden and invisible. And so I became fascinated with this idea of dissolving. And I got back to Australia, I whipped up my final collection in about 5 days, and then I dissolved it. And I still have it in a jar, and it's goo. And that was the end of my 4 years of the degree, and then I moved into the PhD because I wasn't ready to stop learning yet. I felt that I really was just getting into something interesting, but I'd done a lot of work around, well, a lot of my themes in the work that I had done were around ephemerality, transience, haunting, decay, dissolving, and that's what I wanted to keep exploring, but in a very kind of metaphorical way is where I started. I've actually got my initial thesis questions in my proposal, which you can see are very, very, very different to what they ended up being at the end. Big change happened for me during the process was probably about 6 months in when my grandfather died. And because I was looking at dressing and I was looking at sort of metaphors of death, that I thought, well, I'd actually really like to go and dress him and see what this practice actually looks like. And there were a lot of problems that I found. Although it was an incredibly important ritual in my development as a practitioner, but also as a human being and being with my family. There were things that happen in life where your practice and what you know constantly ticks over. So when I'm dressing my grandfather, I was going, why are we putting him in this suit? And I can still see the cake stain from the wedding on his suit, and nothing fits anymore, and wow, he's really heavy and difficult to move around. And then I got to the point where I was doing up the shoelaces on his shoes, and I went, why are we putting him in shoes? Because he's not going to be walking anywhere. And it was that I went, okay, well, why aren't we doing this better? What can I do to make this experience, which was incredibly beautiful, but emotionally very heavy and physically very heavy. So I began thinking about, well, how do we design garments for the dead? But that question came up quite a significantly longer time after I'd initially started. I had 4 major bodies of work. One was what I called body molds, and that was the first project I presented for my my confirmation. And I brought in a swimwear mannequin, which I'd been growing at home for a couple of weeks, and it had grass growing out of it. And I put it down on the bench, and I'm like, here, this is what my PhD's about. Oh, I'm not quite sure, but this is, I've started practice. And one of the panel members sort of said, these aren't PhD questions. I don't really get what this is about. It's not really at the level of a PhD. So I was pretty shattered, but I didn't really know what I was doing, because at that point my grandfather hadn't died yet. And I feel very strange sort of saying that his death was a blessing, but it was. To be involved was an absolute privilege. So things do happen along your candidature that change you significantly. I had the worst breakup of my life midway through. That's always good fun, not. But when I took this swimwear mannequin home, I went, well, bugger this. And I flipped it over. And that act of death of this project actually spawned the next body of research, which was the body molds. And what had happened was that all of the root structure underneath, the hidden aspect of what was actually going on, was revealed. So I became obsessed with revealing the unseen. I went back to my dissolving garments, and I looked at different garment tropes and how we could reveal the underlying skeletal structure of garments. So I did iterations of the same thing over and over and over and over again. And I've got a slide in there which says, kill your darlings, because at some point you just have to go, all right, that's great, thank you, on to the next. And it's really messy at times. That second year was pretty horrific in terms of not knowing what I was doing. So I started in 2008 and in 2012. So I'm going to do the same thing. Sometimes it does take a lot longer. I wish that I had taken 1 year off because I did a project that went for a year and took a year to develop. And so I did a lot of sitting around going, what's happening? Yeah, so there's me, 2007, not knowing. Catwalk fashion, and that's nowhere near what I do now. So originally I was looking at dissolvable garments, ghostly garments, combining scientific and spiritual ideas about death to investigate links between dress and deathliness. I went very broad with my questions and too big. How has the perception of death evolved throughout history? What is the perception of death in the 21st century? It was like, yeah, that's ginormous. And so a lot of those ended up getting kind of diffused into what I was doing, but my questions really ended up being, what will you wear, who will dress you, and what will you leave behind? So what will you wear became about the psychology of the living, the people who are going to be dressing you. Who will dress you, once again, became about the physical act of dressing, and what will you leave behind became a lot to do with ecology, environmental awareness, and also what's your sort of spiritual remnant. They end up looking nice and neat, and you put your projects into nice chapters, and Pia was actually my supervisor, and at some point we discussed cutting out this entire chapter, and I had a big cry and said, no, I'm not going to do it. No. I held to it, and one of my examiners said that that was the weakest chapter. But I still held on to it, because for me, I just could not have gone through all of the other stuff without it. And so there are things that you do get advice, you get mixed advice, but in the end, you really do have to hold on to what is true to you. I have no regrets about putting it in. Messy things happen. I cried during a presentation, that was a good one. I had just done a big forensics project, and I wanted to try to recreate some of the ambience of the space. Look, after I'd been looking at metaphors of death, dissolving as a beautiful ephemeral version of putrefaction, and body molds as a metaphor for life that emerges from death, I had to actually go and think, all right, well, what are the realities of this? To prepare myself for dealing of the realities of death, I actually went and trained to become a funeral celebrant. There was a unit within the course which was about self-care. I got myself a psychologist. That was pretty good advice because some of it is actually really, really stressful. And I needed to unpack a lot of, particularly with something like death, a lot of my own thinking about what was going on. Kill your darlings is one thing that I'm going to come back to again. There were so many, I did too much work. I did too many making exercises, I made too many prototypes, I made and I made and I made and I made and I had excessive amounts of projects. What I didn't do, and my biggest regret, and Pia will back me up on this, was that I didn't write. I didn't write enough.
Made to avoid writing at some point.
Yeah, I did procrastinating. Procrastinating, which was really good because I needed to be making, but the last 6 months of the PhD were probably the worst in my life, and I had put myself there because I hadn't done my writing. I'd been reading, I'd been picking up quotes, I had systems for how I was organising things, but the writing, if it's not something you enjoy doing, you have to start doing it early. I think someone said if you wrote 100 words a day, you'd finish your PhD very, very easily, but it doesn't work like that. I wrote entire chapters in the last few months. I wrote conclusions in the week before. I was up the night before going, ah. I actually moved country to avoid distractions at some point. So I didn't have a perfect candidature. I went over time, but the PhD is such a special moment that you get in your life. You miss it when you finished it because you just want to go back and make. You want to research. You want the time allocated to read a whole textbook on forensic taphonomy, and you just don't get that again. So please enjoy it. It is absolutely brutal at times. It is absolutely wonderful at times. So it's a roller coaster. Yes. Obviously my presentation hasn't gone to plan, but thank you. No, we'll go with that.